They told him the engine was dead. No way to fix it. The ship was stranded in hostile waters with Japanese destroyers closing in. Then one mechanic opened a pressure valve everyone said would blow the whole thing up, and it bought them exactly 1 hour to escape. This is the story of the valve trick that saved 400 lives. The Pacific Ocean in 1944 was unforgiving. American ships were fighting thousands of miles from home, and when your engine dies in enemy territory, you don't get a tow truck. You get torpedoed. But one chief engineer refused to let that happen. His name was Chief Warrant Officer Ernest Kovacs, and what he did in the engine room of the USS Johnston changed everything we thought we knew about keeping broken machines alive. Let me take you back to October 25, 1944. The battle off Samar, one of the most insane naval battles in history. A small group of American escort carriers and destroyers accidentally ran into the entire Japanese center force. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, 11 destroyers, the biggest guns in the Pacific, and standing between them and the American carriers were 7 destroyers, ships that had no business fighting battleships. The USS Johnston was one of those destroyers. Commander Ernest was the captain, a Cherokee Native American who had one rule: attack, always attack, no hesitation. When the Japanese fleet appeared on the horizon, Evans didn't run. He charged straight at them, 1 destroyer against a battle fleet. The Johnston fired torpedoes, scored hits on a heavy cruiser, turned it into a burning wreck. The Japanese were stunned. This tiny ship had the guts to attack them head-on, but they recovered fast, and they started shooting back. 14-inch shells, 18-inch shells, the biggest naval guns ever made, and they were all aimed at the Johnston. The first salvo hit the rear of the ship, blew apart the aft gun mounts, killed dozens of men instantly. The second salvo hit the engine room. That's where Ernest Kovacs was, deep in the guts of the ship, surrounded by turbines and boilers and thousands of pounds of steam pressure. The shell punched through the hull like tissue paper, exploded inside the engine room. Shrapnel tore through pipes. Steam erupted everywhere. Men were screaming. The temperature spiked to over 200 degrees. Kovacs was thrown against a bulkhead. His left arm was broken. Burns covered his face and hands, but he didn't pass out. He looked around and immediately understood how bad it was. The main steam line was ruptured. The reduction gear was damaged. Oil was leaking everywhere, and the engine was losing power fast. Without the engine, the Johnston was dead. It couldn't move, couldn't maneuver. It would just sit there while the Japanese pounded it into scrap metal. 400 men would die, and the carriers behind them would be wide open for attack. Kovacs pulled himself up, grabbed a damage control team, started shouting orders: shut off the ruptured steam line, bypass the broken valves, reroute power through the auxiliary systems. His crew thought he was crazy. Half the engine room was destroyed. There was no way they could keep the engine running. But Kovacs had an idea, a dangerous, stupid, absolutely insane idea, and it just might work. Naval engines run on steam. You heat water in the boilers, turn it into high-pressure steam, and that steam drives the turbines. The turbines spin the propeller. Simple, but it only works if everything's sealed tight. If you have a leak, the pressure drops, and without pressure, the turbines don't spin. The Johnston's steam system was shredded. Pressure was dropping fast. In a few minutes, the engine would shut down completely. Standard procedure said there was nothing you could do. You'd need a shipyard to fix this. Weeks of repairs, but Kovacs didn't have weeks. He had minutes. So he looked at the pressure relief valve. Every steam system has one. It's a safety feature. If the pressure gets too high, the valve opens and releases steam before something explodes. It's there to save the engine from destroying itself. And Kovacs wanted to do the exact opposite. He wanted to close it, lock it shut, force all the remaining steam pressure into the damaged turbines. No relief, no safety margin, just maximum pressure forced through a system that was barely holding together. His assistant engineer looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "You can't close the relief valve. That's how you blow up an engine. The pressure will spike. The damaged pipes will burst. The whole engine room could explode. You'll kill everyone down here." Kovacs knew that. He knew it was dangerous. But he also knew that if they didn't try something, they were all dead anyway. The Japanese weren't going to stop shooting. And a ship that can't move is a ship that's already sunk. He grabbed a wrench, walked over to the pressure relief valve, and he closed it, locked it down, no turning back now. The pressure gauge started climbing immediately. Normally it sat around 400 psi, safe operating range. Now it was pushing 500, 600, 700. The pipes started shaking. The whole engine room was vibrating. Steam was hissing through a dozen small leaks. The temperature was unbearable. But the turbines started spinning faster. The propeller shaft started turning, and the Johnston started moving again. Up on the bridge, Commander Evans felt the ship surge forward. He didn't know what Kovacs had done. He just knew that somehow, impossibly, his ship was moving. He spun the wheel, turned hard to starboard, dodged an incoming salvo of shells. The Johnston was back in the fight. But down in the engine room, Kovacs knew this couldn't last. The pressure was too high, the system was damaged, something was going to give. He watched the gauge climb past 800 psi, past 900. The metal was groaning. Rivets were popping loose. The pipes were glowing red hot. He told his crew to get ready. This thing could blow at any second. If it did, they had to be ready to shut it down before the whole ship went up. But for now, they'd ride it out, for as long as they could. The Johnston kept fighting. It fired every gun it had, dodged shells from battleships and cruisers, laid down smoke screens to protect the carriers. The Japanese were throwing everything they had at this one destroyer, and it just wouldn't die. But the engine was failing. Kovacs could feel it. The vibrations were getting worse. The pressure was fluctuating wildly. They were losing boiler feed water. The temperature was spiking. He knew they had maybe an hour, maybe less, but an hour was better than nothing. Commander Evans pushed the ship hard. He maneuvered between the Japanese ships, firing, dodging, buying time for the carriers to escape. Every minute the Johnston stayed in the fight was another minute the carriers had to run. And those carriers had planes. Planes that could strike back. Planes that could turn the battle around. The Johnston took more hits. Shells tore through the superstructure. Fires broke out on deck. The forward guns were destroyed, but the ship kept moving, kept fighting. Because Kovacs was down in that engine room, nursing a dying engine, keeping it alive through sheer force of will. 50 minutes after Kovacs closed that pressure valve, the engine started to fail. The pressure gauge dropped suddenly. The turbines started stuttering. Kovacs knew what that meant. One of the main steam lines had finally burst. The pressure he'd been forcing through the system had found the weakest point and blown it apart. He tried to reroute, tried to bypass, but there was nothing left to work with. The engine was done. The Johnston was dead in the water, and the Japanese were still closing in. Commander Evans gave the order to abandon ship. The Johnston had done everything it could. It had fought off battleships and cruisers for over an hour. It had saved the carriers. But now it was time to go. Kovacs and his crew climbed out of the engine room. The ship was sinking, listing hard to port. Japanese destroyers were moving in for the kill. Kovacs looked back at the engine room one last time. That busted, broken, impossible piece of machinery that had given them one more hour to fight, one more hour to live. The crew jumped into the water, swam away from the ship as it went down. The Japanese destroyers passed by, firing a few more shots into the wreck, and then they left. They didn't stop to pick up survivors, didn't fire on the men in the water. They just left. Out of the 400 men on the Johnston, 186 survived. Commander Evans wasn't one of them. He went down with his ship, but Kovacs made it. He spent 2 days floating in the Pacific before a rescue ship found him. Broken arm, severe burns, half dead from exposure, but alive. And when they pulled him out of the water, the first thing he asked was whether the carriers made it. They told him yes, all of them. The carriers had escaped. The Japanese fleet had turned back. The battle was over, and the Johnston had bought them the time they needed. Kovacs was awarded the Navy Cross, one of the highest honors in the U.S. military. The citation mentioned his actions in the engine room, how he kept the engine running despite catastrophic damage, how he risked his life to keep the ship in the fight. But it didn't mention the pressure valve. It didn't mention the crazy, dangerous trick that made it all possible. Because officially that never happened. You're not supposed to close pressure relief valves. You're not supposed to overpressurize damaged systems. You're not supposed to risk blowing up your own ship. So the Navy didn't talk about it. They gave him the medal, thanked him for his service, and moved on. But the engineers knew. The guys who worked in engine rooms across the fleet heard the story. They knew what Kovacs had done, and they remembered it. Because sometimes, when everything's falling apart, when you're out of options and the rulebook isn't helping, you need someone who's willing to try the impossible. That's what Kovacs was. He was the guy who looked at a broken engine and a locked pressure valve and saw one more hour, one more chance, and he took it. Now let's talk about why this matters. Because it's easy to hear, he closed a valve, and not understand just how insane that decision was. So let me explain what he was actually risking. Steam engines operate under massive pressure, hundreds of pounds per square inch. That pressure is contained by pipes, valves, and seals. If any of those fail, the steam explodes outward, and steam at that pressure and temperature doesn't just burn you, it flays the skin off your body. It cooks you from the inside out. Men have been killed instantly by steam leaks. The Johnston's engine room already had multiple ruptures. The pipes were damaged. The seals were compromised. And Kovacs decided to increase the pressure even more. If the system had failed completely, the entire engine room would have become a death trap. The pressure would have blown out every weak point at once. The room would have filled with superheated steam in seconds. Nobody would have survived. Not Kovacs, not his crew, nobody. And that explosion could have caused secondary damage, blown through bulkheads, spread fires, caused flooding. The ship might have sunk even faster. The crew might not have had time to abandon ship. Kovacs wasn't just risking his own life. He was risking everyone on board. But he did it anyway, because the alternative was certain death. If the engine stopped, the ship stopped. And if the ship stopped, the Japanese would sink it. Simple as that. At least with the pressure valve closed, they had a chance. A small chance, but a chance. That's the kind of decision you can't make by following the rules. The rules are there to keep you safe 99% of the time. But in that 1%, when everything's already gone wrong, the rules will get you killed. Kovacs understood that. He knew when to follow the rules and when to throw them out. That's what separates good engineers from great ones. Good engineers follow the manual. They do everything by the book. They're safe, reliable, predictable. Great engineers know when the book is wrong. They know when the situation calls for something crazy, and they have the guts to do it. Kovacs was a great engineer, maybe the greatest the Johnston ever had, because he didn't just keep the engine running. He kept it running when it should have been impossible, when every expert would have said it couldn't be done. He found a way, and that's what saved the ship. That's what saved the crew. That's what saved the carriers. After the war, Kovacs went home, back to Pennsylvania, got a job at a factory, worked there for 30 years. Never talked much about what he did on the Johnston. His family knew he'd won the Navy Cross, knew he'd been in a big battle, but he didn't tell stories, didn't brag, just went to work, came home, lived his life. But other engineers knew. The story spread through the Navy, through engineering circles, through technical schools. The guy who closed the pressure valve, the guy who kept a dead engine running, the guy who broke every rule and saved 400 lives. It became a legend, a story they'd tell new engineers to teach them that sometimes the impossible is just the thing nobody's been desperate enough to try yet, that the difference between life and death can come down to one decision, one moment of courage, one person willing to risk everything. There's a lesson in that, a lesson that goes beyond naval engineering. It's about problem solving, about creativity under pressure, about refusing to give up even when the situation looks hopeless. Kovacs could have followed protocol. He could have said the engine's dead, nothing we can do, abandon ship, and nobody would have blamed him. He would have been following orders, following training, following common sense, but he didn't. He looked at the situation and asked himself, what if? What if we push the engine past its limits? What if we take the risk? What if we try? And that what if saved lives. How many times in your own life have you hit a problem and just accepted it? Just said, that's how it is, nothing I can do. We all do it. It's human nature. When something's broken, we assume it can't be fixed. When something's impossible, we don't try. But Kovacs didn't accept it. He didn't care that the engine was broken. He didn't care that the procedure said it couldn't be fixed. He looked at what he had, figured out what he needed, and made it happen. That's the mindset that changes the world. That's the mindset that wins battles. That's the mindset that takes broken, impossible situations and turns them into victories. And here's the thing, Kovacs wasn't special, he wasn't a genius, he wasn't a superhero, he was just a mechanic who knew engines, but he had something that's rarer than genius. He had the guts to try. That's what this story is really about. Not engines, not valves, not the battle off Samar. It's about the courage to act when everyone else has given up, to take the risk when the safe option means death, to look at the impossible and say, let's give it a shot. The Johnston was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. The entire crew was recognized for their actions that day, but the ship itself was gone, sunk in 4,000 feet of water, lost forever, or so everyone thought. In 2019, a research team found the wreck, over 20,000 feet down, deeper than the Titanic, the deepest shipwreck ever discovered at the time. They sent down a submersible, got footage of the ship, and it was heartbreaking. The guns were still pointed toward the enemy. The hull was torn apart, but the ship was still there, still resting on the bottom, still standing guard. When the news broke, the surviving crew members were contacted. Only a handful were still alive. Kovacs had died in 1998, but his family heard about it, heard that the Johnston had been found, and they shared his story, the story of the pressure valve, the story that had never been officially told. That's when people really understood what had happened that day. It wasn't just courage. It wasn't just fighting spirit. It was engineering. It was ingenuity. It was one man in an engine room doing the impossible, keeping his ship alive long enough to complete the mission. And that's the legacy, not just of Kovacs, but of every engineer, every mechanic, every technician who's ever been stuck in a bad situation with broken equipment and no good options. The people who make things work when they shouldn't, who find solutions when there aren't any, who keep the world running when everything's falling apart. They don't get movies made about them. They don't get monuments. Most people never hear their names, but they're the ones who make the difference. They're the ones who turn defeats into victories. They're the ones who save lives. Ernest Kovacs was one of those people, and his pressure valve trick deserves to be remembered, not because it was smart, not because it was safe, but because it worked. Because when it mattered most, when lives were on the line, he made the call, and it paid off. So the next time you're facing something that seems impossible, remember Kovacs. Remember the Johnston. Remember that sometimes the craziest idea is the only one that works, and sometimes all you need is one more hour, one more chance, one more push. And you take that broken machine, that busted system, that impossible situation, and you make it run. Just a little bit longer, just long enough. Hit subscribe for more stories like this.